The sun hung like a copper coin in the bleached sky, and Marcus Brennan watched it through eyes that had long ago learned to read death in the desert. His ranch house sat alone in a basin of cracked earth, surrounded by mesquite and memories of better years. The well behind his barn was down to its last few feet of water, brown and gritty but precious as blood in this, the worst drought anyone could remember. He'd come to this land 20 years ago, a young man with dreams of cattle and prosperity. The Apaches had been here longer, of course, centuries longer, but there had been a kind of understanding between them and the handful of white settlers scattered across this territory. The land was harsh enough that it made neighbors of necessity from people who might otherwise have been enemies. Marcus had learned some of their language, traded with them fairly, and kept his word. In the Apache way, that had meant something. The drought had been strangling the land for 3 seasons now. Springs that had run since before human memory had coughed dry. Rivers became trickles, then dust. Marcus had watched his herd dwindle from 200 head to 30, then to a handful of skeletal creatures he'd finally sold or slaughtered rather than watch them suffer. His neighbors had packed up and left, one by one, until he was the last white man in 50 miles. He'd stayed partly out of stubbornness, that particular brand of foolishness that keeps men clinging to failing dreams. But mostly he'd stayed because this land had taken his sweat and his youth, and he'd be damned if he'd abandon it without seeing rain one more time. The day the chief's daughters came, Marcus had been examining his well with the grim attention of a man counting his remaining hours. The water was low enough now that he could see the bottom. Maybe 3 days left if he was careful. A week if he stopped washing and cut his drinking to the bare minimum. He'd already stopped trying to keep any garden, had long since given up on anything but pure survival. He heard their horses first, 3 of them coming up the long approach to his ranch. For a moment his heart seized, thinking of raiders or trouble, but then he recognized Little Dove, the chief's youngest daughter, her face the color of polished walnut beneath the harsh sun. With her were her 2 older sisters, women he'd traded with over the years at the seasonal gatherings. They came into his yard with a dignity that Apache women carried like invisible crowns. Their horses were in no better condition than everything else in this dying land, ribs showing, heads hanging low. But it was the women themselves that stopped Marcus's breath. Little Dove, who couldn't have been more than 16, was swaying in her saddle. The other 2 were holding themselves upright through sheer will, their lips cracked and bleeding, their eyes sunken deep. "Mr. Brennan," Little Dove said in careful English, her voice like wine through dried grass. "We go to find our brothers. 3 days east. Our water gone. We ask for drink, then we go." Marcus looked at them, really looked. These weren't warriors or hunters. They were 3 young women trying to reach their family, caught in the drought like everything else. He thought of his well, of those 3 remaining days of water. He thought of how many times Chief Nantan had helped him track lost cattle, how the chief's wife had brought medicine when Marcus had fever, how these same daughters had taught his own departed wife to weave baskets in the Apache way during those early, easier years. "Get down," he said. "Come inside where it's cooler." He gave them water, more than he should have, watching them drink with a desperate gulping of creatures who've looked death in its dried-out face. He gave them jerky from his dwindling supplies, hard biscuits, and more water. Little Dove wept silently as she drank, and Marcus had to turn away from the sight. They rested in the shade of his porch for 2 hours, and he filled their water skins from his well, watching the level drop dangerously low. When they left, they clasped his hands in the Apache way, pressing their foreheads to his in gratitude. Little Dove tried to give him a silver bracelet, but he refused it. "You helped my wife when she was sick," he said. "We're even." They rode east toward the mountains, and Marcus went back to his well and stared at what remained. Maybe a day and a half now, he figured. 2 days if he was lucky, and the night condensation added a few inches. That had been 2 days ago. He'd expected to die alone, honestly. Expected to make his peace with God and the desert and close his eyes when the water ran out. Another casualty of the drought that was turning the whole territory into a graveyard. What he hadn't expected was to wake to the sound of horses, dozens of them, and to stumble out onto his porch to see what looked like half the Apache nation assembled at his gate. They sat motionless on their horses, maybe 40 warriors in their prime, silent as stone monuments in the early morning light. At their head was Chief Nantan himself, A man who carried 70 years with the strength of oak. Beside him were his 3 daughters, alive and healthy, their faces solemn. Marcus's hand drifted toward the rifle beside his door, then stopped. This wasn't a war party, not exactly. There were no weapons drawn, no war paint, no hostility in their posture. But there was something else there, something he couldn't quite read, and his heart hammered against his ribs like it was trying to escape what was coming. Chief Nantan dismounted and walked forward, alone, his gait slow and deliberate. Marcus stepped off his porch to meet him, acutely aware of his dry mouth, his trembling hands, the complete vulnerability of his position. "My daughters tell me you gave them water," the chief said in English. He spoke it well, better than Marcus spoke Apache. "Yes. They tell me you gave them water when your well was nearly empty. Water that was meant to keep you alive." Marcus nodded, not trusting his voice. The chief studied him for a long moment. Behind him, the wall of warriors remained motionless, their faces unreadable. Marcus could feel his own death in the air, though he couldn't understand why it would come like this. "You could have refused," the chief said. "You could have told them to find water elsewhere. You could have kept what was yours and let the desert decide their fate." "I could have," Marcus agreed, his voice rough. "Didn't seem right, though." Something that might have been a smile flickered across the chief's face, gone too quickly to be sure. He turned and raised one hand, a simple gesture that somehow commanded absolute attention. The warriors dismounted as one, and for a terrible moment Marcus thought they were preparing to charge. Instead, they began unloading their horses. Water skins, dozens of them, came off the pack animals. Food bundles. Tools. The warriors moved past Marcus like he was invisible, straight to his well, and began the organized work of men who've done hard labor together their whole lives. Some disappeared into his barn and emerged with his old and used fencing materials. Others began constructing a shade structure over the well itself. Marcus stood frozen, unable to process what was happening. Chief Nantan remained beside him, watching his men work. "We found water in the deep canyon," he said quietly. "Took us 4 days to reach it. It's enough for our people for now, maybe longer. My daughters would have died before they reached it, if not for you." "I just gave them a drink," Marcus said, feeling stupid even as he said it. "You gave them life from your own remaining days," the chief corrected. "That is not a small thing. That is not a thing my people forget." The warriors worked through the morning and into the afternoon. They dug deeper into Marcus's well and found another seam of water, a thin vein he'd never known existed. They reinforced the walls and installed a better pulley system. They brought him venison and dried fruits and enough food to last a month. One of them, a young man with clever eyes, showed him a technique for catching night condensation that could add precious cups to his daily water supply. Chief Nantan stayed with Marcus on the porch, watching his people work, occasionally calling out instructions. "My daughters are precious to me," he said at one point. "Little Dove is the youngest, the last child of my late wife. When I heard what you did, I told my warriors we would go to the white man's ranch and we would stand at his gate." "I thought you'd come to kill me," Marcus admitted. The chief actually laughed at that, a sound like wind chimes in the dry air. "Kill you? For saving my daughters? What kind of people do you think we are?" "I didn't know what to think." "We came to stand at your gate," the chief said, "because a man who would give his last water to 3 Apache women who are not his kin, who are not his people, who could bring him no benefit, that man deserves to have warriors stand at his gate. Not to threaten him, but to honor him. To ensure that if death comes for him, it will have to go through us first." Marcus felt something crack inside his chest, some hard shell he'd been carrying for years. He blinked rapidly, trying to clear the dust from his eyes, though there was no wind. By evening, his ranch was transformed. His well was deeper and better built than it had ever been. His stores were full. The warriors mounted their horses with the same silent dignity they'd shown arriving. Chief Nantan clasped Marcus's hand in the Apache way, then pulled him into a brief, fierce embrace. "When the rain comes," the chief said, "and it will come, you will rebuild. And you will remember that you are not alone in this land." "I'll remember," Marcus promised. They rode out as the sun set, that wall of warriors dissolving into the gathering darkness. Marcus stood at his gate long after they'd vanished, thinking about water and honor, about kindness and survival, about the strange mathematics of giving away what you cannot spare and receiving more than you could imagine in return. That night, he drank from his well without rationing, and it tasted sweeter than anything he could remember.